When my son won $12 million, the first thing he did wasn't celebrate with me or thank the woman who raised him. No, the first thing Gary did was look me straight in the eye and tell me I was dead weight. "I don't need you anymore, Mom. Pack your bags." Those words still echo in my head 3 months later. But honey, let me tell you something. Sometimes the universe has a funny way of teaching people lessons they never saw coming. My name is Phyllis Turner, and I'm 68 years old. I've lived in Las Vegas, Nevada my whole life, watching this desert bloom into something I barely recognize anymore. But this story isn't about the city. It's about family, greed, and how a mother's love can turn into a mother's justice when pushed too far. If you've ever been taken for granted by someone you'd die for, you'll understand every word I'm about to tell you. Now, before I dive deep into this tale, I want you to do something for me. If this story speaks to your heart, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. And honey, if that little hype button appears on your screen, click it for me. It helps stories like mine reach other women who might need to hear them. Sometimes we don't realize our own strength until someone pushes us to find it. 3 months ago, I thought I knew my son. 3 months ago, I believed that blood was thicker than water and that the boy I raised would never abandon the woman who sacrificed everything for him. 3 months ago, I was wrong about a lot of things, but I wasn't wrong about everything. And that's where this story gets interesting. You see, when someone shows you their true colors, believe them the first time. And when they forget that you hold cards they don't even remember dealing you, well, that's when life gets real interesting real fast. What Gary forgot in his lottery-winning euphoria was something that was about to change both our lives forever. Something he signed his name to 3 years ago when he was desperate, and I was the only person in the world willing to take a risk on him. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because every good story needs proper context. And trust me, sugar, this context is everything. I was born in 1955 in downtown Las Vegas, back when it was still more tumbleweeds than neon lights. My daddy worked construction on some of the first big casinos, and Mama cleaned hotel rooms until her hands were raw and her back gave out. We weren't poor, but we sure weren't rich either. Just regular working folks trying to make an honest living in a city built on luck and dreams. I married my high school sweetheart, Robert Turner, when I was 19 years old. Bobby was a good man, worked as a mechanic at Henderson Motors for 37 years, never missed a day unless he was flat on his back with fever. We had Gary when I was 27, and for 8 beautiful years, we were a complete family. Bobby taught Gary how to throw a football, how to change oil in a car, and how to treat people with respect. Those were good years, honey. The kind of years you don't appreciate until they're gone. But life has a way of sucker punching you when you least expect it. Bobby had a heart attack at work in 1990. Died right there in bay number 3 with a wrench still in his hand. Gary was only 8 years old, and suddenly, I was a single mother in a city where everybody's hustling for something. The life insurance helped for a while, but it wasn't enough to cover the mortgage and raise a growing boy who needed everything from school clothes to baseball gloves. I took a job at the Westward Ho Casino downtown, working the graveyard shift in the coffee shop. From 11 at night until 7 in the morning, I served coffee and pie to drunk tourists and desperate gamblers, watching them blow their paychecks on machines that never loved them back. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid steady, and steady was what Gary and I needed. Those were hard years, I won't lie to you. Gary would be asleep when I left for work, and asleep when I got home. I'd catch maybe 4 hours of sleep before getting him ready for school, helping with homework, and making sure he had everything he needed. On weekends, we'd go to the park or catch a movie at the Dollar Theater, just the 2 of us against the world. I thought I was doing everything right. I thought I was teaching him the value of hard work, the importance of family, and how to be grateful for what you have. Gary was a good student, made decent grades, Stayed out of serious trouble. He played JV basketball at Valley High School and even got a partial scholarship to UNLV for business administration. I was so proud of that boy. I could have burst. But somewhere along the way, something changed in Gary. Maybe it was watching his friends' families take vacations we couldn't afford, or seeing other kids get new cars for their 16th birthdays while Gary rode the bus. Maybe it was the constant struggle, the way I had to say no to things other parents said yes to. Or maybe it was just Vegas itself, this city that promises everyone their one lucky break, away from having everything they ever wanted. Gary graduated from UNLV in 2004 with a business degree and big dreams. He wanted to start his own company, something about importing specialty electronics from overseas and selling them online. The internet was taking off, and Gary was convinced he could make millions if he just had some startup capital. Problem was, no bank in Nevada would give a business loan to a 23-year-old with no credit history and a business plan written on notebook paper. That's when the asking started. "Mom, you could co-sign for me. Just your signature, that's all I need. Once the business takes off, I'll refinance everything in my name. You won't be on the hook for anything." He had numbers and projections, spreadsheets that showed how he'd be making 6 figures within 2 years. Gary was persuasive, I'll give him that. Always had been, even as a little boy. But I'd seen too many people in this town chase dreams that turned into nightmares. I said no the first dozen times he asked. Told him to get a regular job, build some credit, save some money, and then think about starting a business. That advice didn't sit well with a young man who thought he knew everything. Gary moved out of our little house on Charleston Boulevard and got an apartment near the Strip. For about 6 months, we barely talked. He'd call on holidays, but our conversations were short and strained. He was working at an electronics store in the Forum Shops, hating every minute of it, convinced he was wasting his potential. And maybe he was. Gary always was smart. Just maybe not as smart as he thought he was. Then in 2006, Gary met Destiny Clark at the store where he worked. Destiny was 24, blonde, and had that particular kind of Vegas confidence that comes from knowing men will buy you drinks just for existing. She worked as a cocktail waitress at the Palms, pulling down good money and tips. But she had bigger plans. She wanted to be a model, maybe get into acting, definitely wanted to marry someone with money. Destiny changed Gary, and not for the better. Suddenly he was talking about designer clothes and expensive restaurants, about how he deserved more than a job selling phones to tourists. She fed his ego and his ambition in ways that made him hungry for things he'd never cared about before. Within 6 months of dating her, Gary was back at my door with that loan proposal. Except now it wasn't just his dream. It was their dream. Destiny believes in me, Mom. She sees my potential. Don't you want to see me succeed? That's how he framed it. Like saying Nuku meant I didn't love him or believe in him. It was emotional manipulation, plain and simple. But when it's your only child doing the manipulating, it hits different. The business plan had evolved too. Gary had done more research, had actual suppliers lined up, had even found a small warehouse space he could rent month to month. He showed me testimonials from other online retailers, market research about the growing demand for the products he wanted to sell. And he had that look in his eyes, that mixture of hope and desperation that reminded me so much of his father. Bobby used to get that same look when he talked about opening his own garage someday. He never did. Always something more important to spend the money on. Always some reason to wait another year. Bobby died with that dream still just a dream. And maybe that's part of why I finally said yes to Gary. Maybe I didn't want him to end up like his father, full of regrets about chances not taken. So, in March of 2007, I co-signed Gary's business loan for $485,000. It was the biggest financial risk I'd ever taken in my life, and it was about to become the biggest mistake I'd ever made. But not for the reasons I thought. The first year of Gary's business went better than anyone expected, including Gary himself. Tech-edge electronics, he called it. And for a while it looked like his confidence might actually be justified. He was importing smartphone accessories, portable speakers, and novelty electronics that were popular with college kids and young professionals. The profit margins were good, and Gary had a real knack for online marketing. By Christmas of 2007, Gary had moved into a bigger apartment and was driving a used BMW. Nothing too fancy, but a step up from the beat-up Honda he'd been driving since college. Destiny was still working at the Palms, but she was talking about quitting to help Gary run the business full-time. They seemed happy, and more importantly, the loan payments were current. I was still working at the casino, still living in the same house I'd shared with Bobby and raised Gary in. It wasn't much, a 3-bedroom ranch built in the 70s with original everything, but it was paid off and it was home. Gary would stop by every few weeks, usually to show me sales figures or tell me about some new product line he was considering. Those visits were good for both of us, I think. They reminded me that I'd made the right choice in co-signing that loan, and they reminded Gary where he came from. But by 2008, things started getting complicated. The economy was tanking, people weren't buying as many gadgets, and cheap electronics from China were flooding the market. Gary's profit margins got thinner, and some of his suppliers started demanding payment up front instead of the 30-day terms he'd been used to. He was working 18-hour days, trying to keep inventory moving and cash flowing. That's when Destiny started getting restless. She'd imagined that dating a business owner meant a certain lifestyle, and when that lifestyle didn't materialize as quickly as she'd hoped, she began pushing Gary to take bigger risks. "You need to expand," she'd tell him. "You need to think bigger, order more inventory, get better products, upgrade everything." Gary started missing our regular visits. When he did call, he sounded stressed and distracted. The loan payments were still coming out of his business account on time, but I could tell things were tighter than he wanted to admit. I offered to help however I could. Maybe work some extra shifts. Maybe even consider a second mortgage on the house. But Gary was proud. "I've got it handled, Mom. Business is just going through a rough patch." The rough patch lasted 3 years. From 2008 to 2011, Gary's business limped along, making just enough to cover expenses and loan payments, but not enough to grow or give Gary and Destiny the lifestyle they wanted. I watched my son age in fast forward during those years, saw him develop worry lines and a short temper that reminded me too much of myself during the hardest years after Bobby died. Destiny finally left him in 2011. No dramatic breakup, no big fight that I knew about. She just met a real estate developer at the Palms one night and moved in with him 2 weeks later. Gary was devastated, but honestly, I was relieved. That girl had never loved him. She'd loved the idea of him, the potential of him, but never the actual man working himself to death in a warehouse in Henderson. With Destiny gone, Gary threw himself even deeper into the business. He moved out of the fancy apartment and into a smaller place, started cooking at home instead of eating out, basically did everything he should have done 3 years earlier. But the damage was done. The market had moved on. Bigger companies had taken over the niches he'd carved out, and tech-edge electronics was slowly bleeding to death. That's when Gary moved back home with me. It wasn't supposed to be permanent. "Just until I get back on my feet, Mom. Maybe 6 months. A year at most. But 6 months turned into 2 years, and 2 years turned into a routine." Gary worked out of the spare bedroom I'd converted into an office for him, still trying to save his business, still making those loan payments every month like clockwork. Living together again wasn't easy for either of us. Gary was 31 years old and felt like a failure. I was watching my adult son struggle and didn't know how to help without hurting his pride even more. We stepped on each other's nerves, had the kind of small arguments that come from two people who love each other, but are stuck in a situation neither of them chose. But there were good moments too. Gary would cook dinner sometimes. He'd learned during his bachelor years and was actually pretty good at it. We'd watch old movies together, the same ones we'd watched when he was a kid and money was tight. On Sunday mornings, we'd drive out to Red Rock Canyon and hike the trails, talking about everything except business and money and the future that seemed to be slipping away from both of us. It was during one of those Sunday drives in 2013 that Gary told me he was thinking about shutting down Tech Edge Electronics. I gave it my best shot, Mom, but sometimes your best shot isn't enough. He was quiet for a long time after that, staring out at the red rocks and the blue sky, looking older than his 32 years. What about the loan? I asked, because someone had to. I'll get a regular job. Something steady. We'll keep making the payments until it's paid off. It'll take a while, but we'll get there. That was the moment I realized my son had grown up. Not when he graduated college or started his business or moved in with a girlfriend, but when he sat in my passenger seat and acknowledged that sometimes life doesn't go according to plan, and the only thing you can do is keep moving forward and honor your commitments. Gary closed Tech Edge Electronics in September 2013 and took a job as a sales manager at Best Buy. It wasn't the life he'd dreamed of, but it paid well enough to cover the loan payments and his share of our household expenses. For the first time in years, our finances were stable, and our relationship was good. We'd found our rhythm as roommates and family. But Gary never stopped playing the lottery. Every week, same numbers, same convenience store on Flamingo Road. $5 here, $10 there, occasionally $20 if he was feeling lucky. "It's just entertainment, Mom," he'd say when I'd tease him about it. "Cheaper than going to movies." I never thought those lottery tickets would be anything more than expensive entertainment. I never imagined they'd be the thing that destroyed our relationship and changed both our lives forever. Because on March 15th, 2023, Gary's numbers came up. All of them. $12 million. And that's when I learned that money doesn't just change your circumstances. Sometimes it changes who you are. Or maybe it just reveals who you were all along. The first thing Gary did after confirming his win wasn't hug me or thank me, or even celebrate. The first thing he did was call a lawyer. Not just any lawyer. The most expensive lottery attorney in Las Vegas. The kind of man who charges $500 an hour to help rich people stay rich. The second thing Gary did was start looking at houses online. Not modest houses, not sensible houses, but mansions in the ridges and southern highlands. Places where the driveways cost more than our little house was worth. The third thing Gary did was start treating me like I was invisible. It wasn't immediate. Gary wasn't cruel right from the start. But over the weeks that followed his win, I watched my son transform into someone I didn't recognize. He started talking about lifestyle changes and new directions and upgrading everything. He bought new clothes, a new car, started eating at restaurants I couldn't pronounce the names of, and slowly, gradually, I began to understand that Gary's new life didn't include his old mother. The conversation that changed everything happened on a Tuesday evening in April. Gary had just gotten back from looking at a $7 million house in the Ridges, all excited about the home theater and the wine cellar and the view of the Strip. He was showing me pictures on his phone, describing amenities I couldn't even comprehend. "It's got 6 bedrooms, Mom. 6! And a guest house by the pool." "Sounds lovely, honey. When are you thinking about moving?" That's when Gary got quiet. That's when he put his phone down and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't anger or irritation or even impatience. It was calculation. "Well, that's the thing, Mom. This house, this lifestyle, it's really designed for a younger demographic. The neighbors are all entrepreneurs, tech executives, entertainment industry people. I don't think you'd be comfortable there." I stared at my son, trying to process what he was really saying. "Are you telling me I'm not invited to live with you anymore? I'm telling you this is my chance to start fresh, to build the life I've always wanted. And honestly, Mom, having my 68-year-old mother living with me doesn't really fit the image I'm trying to create." The image he was trying to create. Not the life he wanted to live, or the happiness he wanted to find, but the image he wanted to create. That's when I knew I'd lost him. At least the version of him I'd raised and loved and sacrificed for. But I wasn't ready to give up on my son. Not yet. Gary, we've been through so much together. The business, the hard years, everything. Don't you think we make a good team? That's when Gary said the words that are burned into my memory forever. Mom, I appreciate everything you've done for me. I really do. But I don't need you anymore. I'm rich now. I can hire people to do whatever needs doing. You're just dead weight at this point. Dead weight. His own mother who co-signed a $500,000 loan when no one else would. His own mother who worked graveyard shifts for years to keep food on the table and a roof over his head. His own mother who welcomed him back home when his business failed and his girlfriend left him. Dead weight. I went to my room that night and cried for the first time since Bobby's funeral. But by morning the crying was done, and the thinking had started. Because Gary might have forgotten where he came from, and he might have forgotten who helped him when he needed it most. But there was one thing Gary had definitely forgotten. Something that was going to remind him real quick that dead weight can sink a ship, but it can also anchor it when the storms come. Gary had forgotten about that loan, the one I co-signed, the one that still had $340,000 outstanding, the one that made me just as responsible for the debt as he was. And honey, that's when this story got interesting. 2 weeks after Gary called me deadweight, he made his move official. He'd already put a deposit down on that mansion in the Ridges and hired a moving company to pack up his belongings. But Gary's version of moving out wasn't what most people would consider normal. Gary's version involved him taking everything he considered his, which apparently included furniture I'd bought, dishes I'd inherited from my mother, and even the coffee maker I'd used every morning for 15 years. I'll need to furnish the new place, he said when I questioned him about the coffee maker. You can get a new one. With what money? I wanted to ask, but I held my tongue. Gary hadn't offered to help with mortgage payments or utilities or groceries. In his mind, I was supposed to figure out how to maintain our household on my casino worker pension and Social Security, while he moved into a palace and pretended I didn't exist. The morning of the move, Gary's attitude reached a new low. I was in the kitchen making breakfast, just scrambled eggs and toast, nothing fancy, when he walked in, wearing a designer tracksuit that probably cost more than I made in a month. You know, Mom, this is actually perfect timing, he said, pouring himself coffee from the pot I'd made. I've been thinking about what you should do next, and I have some ideas. I turned around from the stove to look at him. Ideas? Yeah. There are some really nice senior living communities here in Vegas. Places where you'd be around people your own age, with activities and meal plans and everything. I looked into a few online, and they're not that expensive. Senior living communities. My 68-year-old son wanted to put me in a retirement home so I wouldn't embarrass him in front of his new, rich neighbors. Gary, I'm 68, not 98. I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself. I know. But think about it. No more house maintenance, no more yard work, no more worrying about repairs and property taxes. You could just relax and enjoy your golden years. My golden years. The golden years I'd earned by working my ass off to raise him and support his dreams and co-sign his loans. And what about this house? I asked. Well, you could sell it. Real estate market's pretty good right now. You'd probably get enough to cover the down payment on a nice apartment at one of those communities. Gary wanted me to sell the house I'd lived in for 40 years. The house where I'd raised him. The house where every room held memories of his father, so he could start fresh without any reminders of where he came from. That's when I started getting mad. Not sad, not hurt, but genuinely angry. Gary, this conversation is over. You want to move out and start a new life? Fine. But don't you dare stand in my kitchen and tell me how to live the rest of mine. Gary shrugged like my feelings were completely irrelevant to him. It's just a suggestion, Mom. But you should probably start thinking about your future. The gravy train's pulling out of the station. The gravy train. As if me raising him and supporting him and sacrificing for him had been some kind of financial arrangement, instead of what mothers do for their children. That afternoon, Gary finished moving out. He took 3 carloads of stuff, including several boxes of things I was pretty sure belonged to me. When the last box was loaded, he came back inside to say goodbye. "I'll call you in a few days," he said, giving me the kind of awkward hug you give a distant relative at a funeral, once I get settled in. But Gary didn't call in a few days. Gary didn't call for 3 weeks. When he finally did call, it was to invite me to dinner at his new house. "I want you to see the place," he said. "It's really something." I drove out to the Ridges on a Saturday evening, following GPS directions through neighborhoods where the houses kept getting bigger and more expensive. Gary's new mansion sat on a hill overlooking the Strip, all glass and stone and architectural angles that probably looked great in magazines, but felt cold and unwelcoming in person. Gary gave me the full tour, showing off rooms that served no purpose I could understand, and amenities that seemed designed more for impressing visitors than actual living. The house was beautiful, I'll give him that, but it felt like a museum instead of a home. The worst part was dinner. Gary had hired a caterer for the evening, not because it was a special occasion, but because he wanted to show off that he could afford to hire caterers. We ate salmon and quinoa and vegetables I couldn't identify, sitting at a dining room table that could seat 12 people, but felt empty, with just the 2 of us. During dinner, Gary talked about his plans. He was thinking about buying a boat, maybe investing in some tech startups, definitely taking a long vacation to Europe. Everything was about spending money and acquiring things and experiences that would prove to the world that Gary Turner had made it. "What about giving back?" I asked at one point. Maybe setting up a scholarship fund at UNLV or helping other young entrepreneurs get started. Gary looked at me like I'd suggested he light his money on fire. "Mom, I've worked hard for this. I've earned the right to enjoy it. Charity is for people who have more money than they know what to do with. I'm still figuring out what to do with mine." $12 million, and Gary was still figuring out what to do with it. Apparently, taking care of the woman who'd taken care of him wasn't on the list of possibilities. That dinner was the last time Gary and I had a real conversation. After that, our relationship became a series of text messages and brief phone calls, where Gary would update me on his latest purchases or travel plans. He bought a Tesla, then a Porsche, then a motorcycle he never learned to ride. He took trips to Dubai and Monaco, and places I'd only seen in movies. And slowly, I began to realize that my son wasn't just ungrateful. He was completely disconnected from reality. The money had given him everything he thought he wanted, but it had also taken away everything that actually mattered. He had no real friends, no meaningful relationships, no purpose beyond spending money and collecting experiences like trophies. But Gary had made one crucial mistake in his rush to reinvent himself. He'd forgotten about the one thing that connected his old life to his new life, the one thing that could bring his mansion of cards tumbling down. That business loan, the one I co-signed, the one that made me legally responsible for $340,000 in debt. The loan Gary had stopped making payments on. I found out about the missed payments purely by accident. I was at the bank one day in July, making a deposit, when the teller mentioned that someone had been calling about a loan connected to my Social Security number. "Probably just a scam," she said, "but you might want to check your credit report just to be safe." So I did, and that's when I discovered that Gary Turner, millionaire lottery winner, had defaulted on 2 consecutive loan payments. The bank had been trying to reach him for weeks, but Gary had changed his phone number and address without updating his loan information. As the co-signer, I was equally responsible for that debt. If Gary didn't bring the loan current immediately, the bank could come after me for the full remaining balance, plus penalties and fees. $340,000? That was more money than I'd ever seen in my life, let alone had sitting in a bank account. I tried calling Gary, but his new number went straight to voicemail. I tried driving out to his house, but there was a gate and a security guard who wouldn't let me pass without permission from the homeowner. I even tried contacting his lawyer, but attorney-client privilege meant he couldn't discuss Gary's financial situation with me. For 3 days, I didn't know what to do. The bank wanted their money, Gary was unreachable, and I was staring at the possibility of losing my house, my savings, everything I'd worked for my entire life. But on the 4th day, something clicked in my brain, something that changed everything. I realized that I wasn't powerless in this situation. I wasn't just some old woman being taken advantage of by an ungrateful son. I was a co-signer on a loan that gave me certain rights and options that Gary had apparently forgotten about. And honey, that's when I decided to teach my son a lesson about what dead weight can really do when it starts moving. The first thing I did was hire my own lawyer. Not some fancy attorney like Gary had, but a woman named Rachel Kim, who specialized in family financial disputes and elder abuse cases. Rachel was about 40, Korean-American, tough as nails, and she did not like what she was hearing about Gary's behavior. "Let me get this straight," Rachel said during our first meeting. "Your son won $12 million, kicked you out of his life, and then stopped making payments on a loan you co-signed, putting your financial security at risk. That about sums it up," I told her. "And he hasn't responded to any of your attempts to contact him about this loan? Nothing. It's like I don't exist anymore." Rachel leaned back in her chair and smiled the kind of smile that probably made opposing lawyers nervous. "Mrs. Turner, your son may think he's forgotten about that loan, but the loan hasn't forgotten about him. And more importantly, the law hasn't forgotten about what he owes you. Here's what I learned from Rachel that day. When you co-sign a loan, you're not just doing someone a favor. You're entering into a legal contract that gives you certain rights and protections. If the primary borrower defaults, the co-signer can demand to be removed from the loan, which triggers an immediate review of the borrower's financial situation. But that wasn't the most interesting part. The most interesting part was that if the primary borrower has sufficient assets to cover the loan balance, the co-signer can petition the court to force the sale of those assets to satisfy the debt. And if the primary borrower has been financially abusive toward the co-signer, say by abandoning them after achieving sudden wealth, that can be grounds for additional damages. Your son has $12 million, Rachel explained. He can absolutely afford to pay off this loan. The question is whether he's going to do it voluntarily or whether we're going to have to make him do it. I thought about that for a long time. Part of me still hoped that Gary would come to his senses, that he'd realize what he was doing to me and make things right on his own. But another part of me, the part that had been growing stronger since he called me dead weight, knew that Gary wasn't going to do the right thing unless he was forced to. "What are my options?" I asked Rachel. "Well, we can start by demanding that Gary be removed as the primary borrower, which would require him to either pay off the loan in full or provide substitute collateral. Given his lottery winnings, the bank would almost certainly demand full payment. And if he refuses, then we can file suit for elder financial abuse and breach of fiduciary duty. As his co-signer, Gary owed you certain obligations that he's clearly violated. Nevada law allows for significant damages in these kinds of cases." I went home that day with a lot to think about. Taking legal action against your own child isn't something any mother wants to do, but allowing your own child to destroy your financial security isn't something any mother should have to tolerate either. That night, I tried calling Gary one more time. I left a voicemail explaining the situation with the loan, explaining how his missed payments were affecting me, asking him to please call me back so we could work something out. I tried to keep my voice calm and reasonable, tried to appeal to whatever love and respect he might still have for me. Gary never called back. 2 days later, I called Rachel and told her to proceed with the legal action. If Gary wanted to treat me like dead weight, then dead weight was exactly what he was going to get. The first shot across Gary's bow came in the form of a letter from Rachel's office, sent via certified mail to his mansion in the Ridges. The letter outlined the situation with the defaulted loan and demanded that Gary either bring the payments current immediately or agree to pay off the loan in full within 30 days. Gary's response came not through his lawyer or a phone call, but through a text message to my cell phone. "Can't believe you're trying to shake me down. Thought you were better than that." Shake him down. Asking my son to honor his financial obligations was somehow extortion in his mind. Rachel's second letter was less polite than the first. It formally notified Gary that we were petitioning the bank to remove me as co-signer due to the primary borrower's default, and that we were prepared to file suit for elder financial abuse if the matter wasn't resolved immediately. This time, Gary's lawyer responded. A very expensive, very condescending letter that basically said Gary's financial affairs were none of my business and that I should be grateful for everything he'd done for me over the years. Everything he'd done for me. The man had that backwards. That's when Rachel filed the paperwork with the bank to force a review of the loan status. Because Gary had missed multiple payments and had sufficient assets to cover the debt, the bank immediately demanded payment in full within 30 days. No more monthly payments, no more extensions. They wanted their $340,000 plus penalties and fees, which brought the total to just over $380,000. Gary had 30 days to come up with $380,000 or face legal consequences that could include liens on his new house and seizure of his other assets. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought Gary would pay the money, learn his lesson, and maybe even apologize for putting me through this nightmare. I was wrong. Instead of paying the loan, Gary hired a team of lawyers to fight the bank's demand. He claimed that the missed payments were an administrative error, that he'd been traveling and hadn't received the payment notices, that his lottery winnings were being held in trust and weren't immediately accessible. All lies, of course. Gary had been posting pictures of his European vacation on social media the same weeks he was supposedly too busy to make loan payments, and his lottery winnings had been deposited months earlier. But Gary's legal strategy became clear pretty quickly. He was going to drag this out as long as possible, hoping that I'd run out of money to pay my own lawyer and eventually give up. Gary had underestimated two things: how much money Rachel was willing to front for a case she believed in, and how determined a woman could be when her own child tried to destroy her. The battle was about to get a lot more interesting. The court date was set for October 15th, 2023, exactly 7 months after Gary won the lottery, and 2 months after he'd stopped making loan payments. In the weeks leading up to the hearing, both sides gathered evidence and prepared for what was essentially going to be a public airing of our family's dirty laundry. Rachel subpoenaed Gary's bank records, his social media accounts, and his travel expenses. What we found painted a picture of a man who was spending money like it was going out of style, while simultaneously claiming he couldn't afford to honor his debts. Gary had spent $180,000 on cars, $75,000 on travel, and $50,000 on furniture and artwork for his new house. He'd also given $25,000 to Destiny Clark, his ex-girlfriend who'd left him years earlier, but had apparently reconnected with him after hearing about his lottery win. But the most damaging evidence was Gary's own words. Rachel's team had screenshot dozens of social media posts where Gary bragged about his wealth, talked about cutting toxic people out of his life, and made jokes about being too rich to worry about small debts. In one particularly damning post, Gary had written, "The best part about having money is that you get to choose who deserves your time and attention. Some people need to learn they're not entitled to your success just because they knew you when you were poor." Reading those words felt like being slapped. This wasn't the son I'd raised. This was a stranger wearing my son's face. Gary's legal team, meanwhile, was trying to paint me as a gold digger who was trying to take advantage of her son's good fortune. They claimed that I'd been financially dependent on Gary for years, that I'd pressured him into the original loan agreement, and that my current legal action was motivated by greed rather than legitimate financial concerns. It was character assassination, plain and simple, but Rachel had prepared me for this. "They're going to try to make you the villain," she'd warned me. "They're going to say terrible things about you in open court. But remember, we have the facts on our side, and the facts don't lie." The night before the court hearing, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about everything that had led to this moment. Gary's childhood, his struggles, his success, his transformation into someone I didn't recognize. I wondered if I was doing the right thing, if there was some other way to resolve this that wouldn't destroy what was left of our relationship. But then I remembered his words, "You're dead weight." I remembered him trying to convince me to sell my house and move into a retirement home. I remembered the complete indifference in his voice when he talked about cutting toxic people out of his life. Gary had made his choice. Now I was making mine. The hearing was held in a conference room at the Clark County Courthouse. Not a dramatic courtroom, like you see on TV. Gary sat at one table with his 3 lawyers, all of them wearing suits that probably cost more than my car. I sat at another table with Rachel, wearing my best dress and trying to look more confident than I felt. This was the first time I'd seen Gary in person since that disastrous dinner at his mansion. He looked good, tanned and relaxed and expensive. He also looked at me like I was a stranger he vaguely disliked, not the woman who'd given birth to him and raised him and sacrificed everything for his happiness. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Gary's lawyers argued that the missed payments were an honest mistake, that Gary had every intention of resolving the debt, and that my legal action was premature and vindictive. They painted Gary as a devoted son who'd been blindsided by his mother's sudden hostility. Rachel painted a different picture. She walked the judge through Gary's spending patterns, his social media posts, his complete lack of communication with me after defaulting on the loan. She showed bank records proving that Gary had sufficient funds to pay off the debt, but had chosen instead to spend money on luxury items while leaving me legally responsible for his obligations. The most powerful moment came when Rachel called me to testify about Gary's behavior since winning the lottery. I told the judge about being called dead weight, about Gary's suggestion that I sell my house and move into senior living, about his complete abandonment of me after achieving sudden wealth. "Mrs. Turner," the judge asked me at one point, "if your son were to pay off this loan today and apologize for his behavior, would you be willing to restore your relationship with him?" I thought about that question for a long time before answering. "Your Honor, I raised my son to be honest, responsible, and compassionate. The man sitting over there may share my son's DNA, but he's not the person I raised. If Gary wants a relationship with me, he needs to remember who he used to be before the money changed him." Gary's face went red when I said that, but he didn't react otherwise. His lawyers had probably told him to stay quiet and let them do the talking. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. Gary was ordered to pay off the remaining loan balance plus penalties within 10 days. Additionally, the judge found that Gary's behavior constituted elder financial abuse under Nevada law, and ordered him to pay me $125,000 in damages, plus my legal fees. Total cost, to Gary, $548,000, plus whatever he'd paid his own lawyers. But the money wasn't the most satisfying part of the ruling. The most satisfying part was the judge's final comment. "Mr. Turner, you have a legal and moral obligation to honor your debts, regardless of your current financial status. The fact that you attempted to abandon these obligations while simultaneously spending money on luxury items shows a troubling lack of character and integrity. I hope you'll use this experience as an opportunity to reflect on your values and priorities." Gary paid the money within the required 10 days. A cashier's check for $548,000 delivered to Rachel's office without any accompanying message or acknowledgement. No apology, no explanation, no request for reconciliation. Just payment, like I was a bill to be settled. Getting that check for $548,000 should have felt like victory. But honestly, it felt more like closure on the saddest chapter of my life. I'd won the legal battle, but I'd lost my son in the process. The money sitting in my bank account couldn't fill the hole in my heart where Gary used to be. For about a week after the court ruling, I just sat in my house and tried to figure out what to do next. I had more money than I'd ever dreamed of having, but I also had a family relationship that was probably damaged beyond repair. The phone never rang. Gary never tried to contact me. It was like I'd won the war but lost everything that mattered. Rachel called me on a Thursday afternoon to check on how I was doing. You know, Phyllis, what you did took incredible courage. Not many people would have the strength to stand up to family like that. It doesn't feel like courage, I told her. It feels like the saddest thing I've ever had to do. Maybe, Rachel said. But sometimes doing the right thing and doing the easy thing are two completely different choices. You chose to do the right thing. That conversation got me thinking about what the right thing might be going forward. I had this money now, money that represented years of sacrifice and struggle and heartbreak. What was I supposed to do with it? Put it in the bank and pretend none of this had ever happened? Use it to fund the comfortable retirement Gary had suggested before he showed his true colors? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that this money represented an opportunity, not just for me, but for other people who might be going through struggles similar to what I'd experienced. Other mothers whose children had forgotten their sacrifices. Other elderly people being taken advantage of by family members who saw them as burdens instead of blessings. That's when I started developing what I came to think of as the plan. The plan wasn't about revenge or getting back at Gary. The plan was about taking this painful experience and turning it into something positive, something that could help other people and give my life new meaning and purpose. I started by doing research. How many elderly people in Nevada were dealing with financial abuse from family members? How many single mothers were struggling to support children who would later abandon them? How many people were trapped in situations where they felt powerless against family members who controlled their financial security? The numbers were staggering. According to the National Center on Elder Abuse, financial exploitation affects an estimated 2% of older adults annually, with family members being the most common perpetrators. In Nevada alone, thousands of elderly people were being taken advantage of by the very people who were supposed to love and protect them. But here's what really got my attention. There were very few resources available to help these people fight back. Legal aid organizations were overwhelmed and underfunded. Most elderly victims didn't have the money to hire private attorneys like Rachel. And even when they did, the emotional trauma of fighting family members often prevented them from seeking help. That's when I knew what I wanted to do with Gary's money. I was going to start a foundation to help other people in situations like mine. People who needed legal help but couldn't afford it. People who needed emotional support during family financial disputes. People who needed to know that they weren't alone and that they didn't have to accept being treated like dead weight by their own families. The Phyllis Turner Foundation for Elder Financial Justice. That's what I decided to call it. I spent 3 months working with Rachel and a financial planner to set up the foundation properly. We established it as a 501c3 nonprofit organization with a mission to provide legal assistance, emotional support, and educational resources to elderly people dealing with financial abuse from family members. The foundation would offer 3 main services: free legal consultations with attorneys like Rachel, who specialized in elder law, support groups for people dealing with family financial disputes, and educational workshops to help elderly people recognize and prevent financial abuse before it happened. I put $400,000 of the settlement money into the foundation's endowment fund, keeping $148,000 for my own financial security. It was more money than I needed for my simple lifestyle, but it was also a safety net that would let me focus on the foundation work without worrying about my own expenses. The the hardest part of setting up the foundation wasn't the legal paperwork or the financial planning. The hardest part was deciding whether to make my story public. Rachel thought it would be powerful to have a real person with a real story as the face of the organization, but I wasn't sure I was ready for that kind of exposure. "Your story could help a lot of people, Phyllis," Rachel told me. "When people see that someone like them fought back and won, it gives them hope that they can do the same thing." But going public meant that Gary would definitely find out about the foundation. It meant our family business would be even more exposed than it already was. It meant admitting to the world that my relationship with my son was broken, maybe permanently. After a lot of soul-searching, I decided that helping other people was more important than protecting Gary's reputation or my own privacy. If my story could prevent even one elderly person from being financially abused by their family, then it was worth the embarrassment and pain of making it public. We launched the Phyllis Turner Foundation in February 2024, almost exactly 1 year after Gary won the lottery. Our first office was a small space in downtown Las Vegas. Nothing fancy, but clean and welcoming. Rachel agreed to serve on our board of directors, and we hired 2 part-time staff members, a social worker named Maria, who specialized in elder counseling, and a paralegal named Tom, who could help with intake and basic legal questions. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Our phone started ringing the day we opened, and it didn't stop. Elderly people from all over Nevada were calling to ask for help, with family members who were stealing from them, manipulating them, or abandoning them after taking advantage of their resources. Some of the stories broke my heart, like Eleanor, an 82-year-old widow whose grandson had convinced her to sign over her house deed to help him invest in a business opportunity, then kicked her out when the house was sold. Or Frank, a 70-year-old retired teacher whose daughter had been forging his signature on his pension checks for 2 years before he figured out what was happening. But some of these stories gave me hope, like Margaret, a 67-year-old woman whose son had been pressuring her to move into assisted living so he could sell her house and use the proceeds for his divorce settlement. Margaret came to us before she'd signed anything, and we were able to help her understand her rights and resist the pressure. Each person who came through our doors reminded me why this work was so important. These weren't just statistics or case studies. These were real people whose families had betrayed their trust and tried to steal their security and dignity. And slowly, gradually, I began to realize that Gary's cruelty had inadvertently given me the most meaningful work of my life. The foundation also became my new community. Maria and Tom became like family to me, and the volunteer attorneys who worked with us became friends and colleagues. For the first time in years, I was surrounded by people who shared my values and understood my mission. But the most rewarding part was watching our clients fight back and win. In our first year, the foundation helped recover over $2.3 million in stolen or misappropriated funds for elderly victims of family financial abuse. We helped 37 people avoid losing their homes to family pressure. We provided legal representation for 43 cases of elder financial abuse. Each victory felt personal to me, because I knew exactly what these people were going through. I knew what it felt like to have your own child treat you like you were worthless. I knew what it felt like to discover that someone you trusted with everything was willing to destroy you for their own benefit. But I also knew what it felt like to fight back and win. By the end of 2024, the foundation had grown beyond anything I'd originally imagined. We'd moved to a larger office space, hired additional staff, and expanded our services to include a 24-hour crisis hotline for elderly people dealing with family financial emergencies. We'd also attracted media attention. Local news stations did stories about our work, and I was invited to speak at conferences about elder financial abuse. Each time I told my story publicly, more people reached out for help, and more volunteers offered to support our mission. The strangest part was that I'd never been happier or more fulfilled in my life. Losing Gary had been devastating, but it had also freed me to discover who I really was and what I was capable of accomplishing. At 68 years old, I was finally living the life I was meant to live. But Gary's story wasn't over yet, and neither was ours. The first sign that Gary's perfect new life wasn't so perfect came in March 2024, exactly 1 year after he'd won the lottery. I was at the foundation office when Maria called me over to her computer screen. "Phyllis, you need to see this," she said, pointing to a local news website. The headline read, "Local lottery winner's mansion in foreclosure after tax problems." Gary's beautiful house in the Ridges was being foreclosed on by the IRS for unpaid taxes. According to the article, Gary owed over $3.2 million in federal income taxes on his lottery winnings, plus penalties and interest for failing to file his returns on time. Apparently, Gary had been so busy spending his money that he'd forgotten about the little detail of paying taxes on it. The article quoted an IRS spokesperson saying that lottery winnings are subject to immediate federal income tax withholding, but that many winners don't realize they often owe additional taxes beyond what's withheld at the time of payout. Gary's $12 million lottery win had been reduced to about $7.8 million after initial tax withholdings, but he'd apparently owed another $3.2 million at filing time. Instead of setting aside money for taxes, Gary had spent everything on houses and cars and vacations, leaving himself unable to pay what he owed the government. The foreclosure notice gave him 30 days to pay the full amount owed or lose the house. I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a little bit of satisfaction reading that article. Not because I wanted Gary to fail, but because it proved that actions have consequences, even for lottery winners who think they're above the rules. But the satisfaction was mixed with sadness. This was still my son we were talking about, even if he'd become someone I didn't recognize. Part of me wanted to call him, to offer help or advice or just a sympathetic ear. But another part of me remembered how he'd treated me, how he'd called me dead weight, and tried to convince me to sell my house so he could avoid any reminders of his past. I decided not to reach out. Gary had made his choices, and now he was living with the consequences. If he wanted help or support from his family, he knew where to find me. 2 weeks later, another article appeared in the local news. Lottery winner sells assets to pay tax debt. Gary had sold his Porsche, his Tesla, his motorcycle, and most of his expensive furniture to raise money for his tax bill. He'd also taken out a second mortgage on the mansion to cover the remaining amount owed. But the most interesting detail in the article was buried in the last paragraph. Gary had also borrowed $200,000 from Destiny Clark, his ex-girlfriend, who'd left him years earlier but had reconnected after his lottery win. Destiny, who'd abandoned Gary when his business was struggling, was now loaning him money to save his mansion. The irony was almost too perfect. Gary had paid nearly $600,000 to get rid of me, only to end up financially dependent on a woman who'd already proven she was only interested in his money. Over the following months, more details of Gary's financial troubles became public. The local news seemed fascinated by the story of a lottery winner who'd managed to blow through millions of dollars in less than 2 years. Each article painted a picture of spectacular mismanagement and poor decision-making. Gary had been spending an average of $75,000 per month on luxury items and experiences. He'd bought a $180,000 car collection, spent $200,000 on travel, and invested $500,000 in cryptocurrency that had lost 80% of its value. He'd also given substantial amounts of money to various women he'd met through dating apps, apparently believing that throwing money around was the key to finding love and companionship. But the biggest revelation came in a comprehensive article published by the Las Vegas Review-Journal in August 2024, The Fall of a Lottery Winner: How Bad Decisions Destroyed a $12 million Fortune. According to the article, Gary's current net worth was estimated at less than $2 million, most of it tied up in his heavily mortgaged mansion. He'd burned through $10 million in 18 months, leaving him with barely enough money to maintain his lifestyle for another year. The article also revealed that Gary had been trying to borrow money from several local banks, using his house as collateral for increasingly desperate loans. Most banks had turned him down because his debt-to-income ratio was already too high. But the most shocking detail was that Gary had also reached out to several family members, distant cousins and relatives he hadn't spoken to in years, asking for loans to help him through his temporary cash flow problems. Everyone had said no. Reading that article, I felt a mixture of sadness and vindication. Sadness because this was my son destroying his life through greed and poor judgment. Vindication because it proved that the values I'd tried to teach him, responsibility, gratitude, humility, weren't old-fashioned ideas but essential life skills that even $12 million couldn't replace. But the story was far from over. In October 2024, I received a phone call that changed everything. It was from Rachel. "Phyllis, I just got a very interesting call from Gary's attorney. Apparently, Gary wants to meet with you." "Meet with me? What for?" "He wouldn't say exactly, but I get the impression that Gary's financial situation is even worse than what's been reported in the news. I think he might be looking for help. Help, after everything Gary had put me through, after calling me dead weight and abandoning me when he struck it rich. He was now coming back looking for help." "What do you think I should do?" I asked Rachel. "That's entirely up to you, Phyllis. You don't owe Gary anything. You've already been more than generous by not pursuing additional damages for the emotional distress he caused you." I thought about that conversation for 3 days before making my decision. I would meet with Gary, but only on my terms, only in my space, and only with Rachel present as a witness. The meeting was scheduled for November 15th, 2024, at the Foundation office. Gary would finally see what I'd built with the money he'd been forced to pay me. He would finally understand that his cruelty hadn't destroyed me. It had revealed my strength. The day of the meeting, I arrived early and arranged the conference room carefully. I wanted Gary to see the plaques on the wall, recognizing our work, the thank you letters from clients we'd helped, the newspaper articles about our successes. I wanted him to understand that while he'd been wasting his fortune on cars and vacations, I'd been using his money to help people and make a real difference in the world. Gary arrived exactly on time, and I almost didn't recognize him. The tanned, confident man who'd been living in a mansion just months earlier was gone. In his place was someone who looked older, thinner, and deeply stressed. His clothes were still expensive, but they hung on his frame like he'd lost weight. His hair, which had been perfectly styled during our court appearance, was messed and graying. But what struck me most was his eyes. The arrogance and entitlement that had characterized Gary's behavior since winning the lottery were gone, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "Hello, Mom," he said quietly, settling into the chair across from me. "Hello, Gary," I replied, keeping my voice neutral and professional. For the first few minutes, we just sat there looking at each other while Rachel reviewed her notes. Finally, Gary broke the silence. "I guess you've been reading about my situation. Hard to miss," I said. "It's been front-page news for months." Gary looked down at his hands. "Yeah, well, things haven't gone exactly the way I planned. When you plan poorly, Gary, you get poor results. I tried to teach you that when you were young." I know you did." Gary was quiet for a long moment. "Mom, I need to ask you something, and I know I don't have any right to ask it." Here it comes, I thought. The moment when my proud, arrogant son, who'd called me dead weight, would have to swallow his pride and admit he needed his mother. "I'm listening," I said. Gary took a deep breath. "I need help. Financial help. I've made some really bad decisions, and I'm in trouble. Deep trouble." "How deep?" "I owe about $1, $8 million in various debts, and I only have about $400,000 in liquid assets. If I can't come up with the money by January, I'm going to lose everything. Everything. The mansion, the cars, the lifestyle, the image he'd worked so hard to create. All of it gone because he'd never learned the difference between having money and managing money. What exactly are you asking me, Gary? I'm asking if you'd consider loaning me some money. I know you received a settlement from our legal issues. I know you probably have resources now. I'm asking if you'd help me save my house. The audacity was breathtaking. Gary wanted me to use the money he'd been forced to pay me, money that represented years of sacrifice and heartbreak, to bail him out of problems caused by his own greed and stupidity. And what would I get in return for this loan? I asked. Interest, fair market interest rates, and collateral. I'd put the house up as security. You'd be completely protected. Protected. Like I'd been protected when I co-signed his original business loan, and he'd defaulted on the payments. Gary, I said slowly, do you remember what you said to me the last time we lived together? Do you remember the words you used to describe me? Gary's face flushed red. Mom, I said things I shouldn't have said. I was caught up in the money, in the excitement of winning. I wasn't thinking clearly. You called me dead weight. I know. I'm sorry. I'm really, really sorry. You told me you didn't need me anymore because you could hire people to do whatever needed doing. I was wrong. I was completely wrong. You suggested I sell my house and move into a retirement home so I wouldn't embarrass you in front of your new rich neighbors. Gary winced like I'd slapped him. I can't believe I said those things. I can't believe I treated you like that. For the first time since Gary had walked into the room, I heard something in his voice that sounded like genuine remorse. Not just regret about his current situation, but actual understanding of how much he'd hurt me. Gary, I said, what you did to me wasn't just cruel. It was a betrayal of everything I'd sacrificed for you, everything I'd given you, everything I'd taught you about family and loyalty and love. You didn't just call me dead weight. You treated me like dead weight. I know, Gary said quietly. I know I did. So now you want me to save you from the consequences of your own choices. You want the dead weight to become a life preserver. Gary looked up at me with tears in his eyes. Mom, I know I don't deserve your help. I know I destroyed our relationship, but I'm asking anyway, because I don't have anywhere else to turn. And that's when I knew exactly what I was going to do. Gary, I said, standing up from my chair and walking over to the window that looked out onto downtown Las Vegas. Do you know what this building is? Gary looked confused by the question. It's an office building. This is the headquarters of the Phyllis Turner Foundation for Elder Financial Justice. Do you know what that foundation does? No. I turned back to face him. It helps elderly people who are being financially abused by their own family members. People whose children steal from them, manipulate them, abandon them after taking advantage of their resources. People like me. Gary's face went pale as he began to understand what I was telling him. The money you were court-ordered to pay me? The money you're now asking me to loan back to you? I used most of it to start this foundation. We've helped hundreds of people in situations similar to what you put me through. Mom, let me finish, I said, holding up my hand. In the past year, this foundation has recovered over $2.3 million for elderly victims of family financial abuse. We've prevented dozens of people from losing their homes to family pressure. We've provided legal representation for people who couldn't afford attorneys to fight their own children and grandchildren. Gary sat in stunned silence as I continued. So when you ask me to loan you money to save your mansion, the mansion you bought after calling me dead weight, you're essentially asking me to take money away from elderly abuse victims to bail out an elderly abuser. I'm not an abuser, Gary said weakly. Gary, what would you call someone who abandons their elderly mother after she co-signs a $500,000 loan for them? What would you call someone who defaults on that loan and leaves their mother legally responsible for the debt? What would you call someone who tells their mother she is dead weight and suggests she sell her home to avoid embarrassing him? Gary didn't answer because there was no good answer. By any objective measure, his behavior had constituted elder financial abuse. But here's the thing, Gary, I continued. I'm not completely without compassion for you. You're still my son. even though you've forgotten how to be one. So I'm going to make you an offer." Gary looked up with something that might have been hope in his eyes. "I will help you," I said, "but not the way you want me to." Rachel leaned forward, clearly interested in hearing what I had in mind. "I will not loan you money to maintain your current lifestyle. I will not help you keep a $7 million mansion that you can't afford. I will not enable the same kind of irresponsible financial behavior that got you into this mess in the first place." Gary's face fell, but I wasn't finished. "However, I will help you transition to a more realistic life. I will pay for financial counseling with a legitimate advisor who can help you understand how to manage what money you have left. I will pay for you to attend a financial responsibility course at UNLV, and if you successfully complete both of those programs, I will help you find appropriate housing and employment so you can rebuild your life on a sustainable foundation." Gary stared at me like I'd just spoken in a foreign language. "You want me to give up my house? Gary, you can't afford your house. You never could afford your house. You bought it with lottery winnings instead of building wealth gradually and responsibly. Now the lottery money's gone, and you don't have the income to support that lifestyle. But if you loaned me enough to pay off my debts, then what? You'd be back in the same situation within a year because you still wouldn't have learned how to manage money responsibly. Gary, you burned through $10 million in 18 months. Even if I gave you every penny of the foundation's money, it wouldn't be enough to fund your spending habits long term." Gary was quiet for a long time, processing what I'd said. Finally, he spoke. "What exactly are you offering?" "I'm offering to help you build a real life instead of the fantasy life you've been trying to maintain. I'm offering to help you become the man I raised you to be, instead of the man you became when money corrupted your values." I walked back to my chair and sat down across from him. "Gary, you have about $400,000 left from your lottery winnings. If you manage that money wisely, it's enough to buy a modest house in a good neighborhood, get reliable transportation, and provide a financial cushion while you find steady employment. It's enough to live comfortably for the rest of your life if you make smart choices. But it's not enough to live like a millionaire." "That's right. It's not. Because you're not a millionaire anymore, Gary. You were a millionaire for about 18 months, and you wasted the opportunity." Gary looked around the conference room, taking in the plaques and certificates and thank you letters that covered the walls. "You really built all this with the money from our lawsuit?" "Most of it, yes. The rest came from donations and grants from people who believe in our mission." "And you're really helping hundreds of people?" "We are. Every day. People who are in situations similar to what you put me through." Gary was quiet for another long moment. Then he asked the question I'd been waiting for. "Mom, do you think you could ever forgive me for what I did to you?" I looked at my son. Really looked at him, for the first time since he'd walked into the room. Behind the stress and the fear and the shame, I could see glimpses of the boy I'd raised. The boy who'd helped me with yard work on weekends and brought me coffee in bed on Mother's Day and cried in my arms when his father died. "Gary," I said softly, "forgiveness isn't something you earn by asking for it. Forgiveness is something you earn by changing your behavior and proving that you've learned from your mistakes. What would I have to do? You'd have to accept my offer of help instead of asking for a bailout. You'd have to sell your mansion and move into housing you can actually afford. You'd have to get a job and learn to live within your means. You'd have to stop trying to impress people with money you don't have and start building relationships based on who you are instead of what you own." Gary thought about that for a long time. Finally, he nodded. "Okay," he said. "I'll do it. I'll take your offer. And Gary, there's one more condition." "What's that?" "I want you to volunteer with the foundation. 10 hours a week, helping other families avoid the mistakes you made. I want you to see firsthand what financial irresponsibility does to people. And I want you to help prevent other families from going through what we went through." Gary looked surprised, but he nodded again. "Okay, I can do that." That was the beginning of Gary's rehabilitation, But it wasn't the end of our story. Rebuilding a relationship that had been destroyed by greed and betrayal would take time, patience, and a lot of hard work from both of us. But for the first time in almost 2 years, I had hope that my son might eventually find his way back to being the man I'd raised him to be. The next 6 months were some of the most challenging and rewarding of my life. Watching Gary transition from millionaire lifestyle to middle-class reality was painful but necessary, like watching someone recover from a serious addiction. Gary sold his mansion in the Ridges for $4.2 million, which was enough to pay off his remaining debts and leave him with about $800,000 in liquid assets after taxes and fees. It was still more money than most people ever see in their lifetime. But for Gary, who'd grown accustomed to spending $75,000 per month, it represented a dramatic lifestyle change. Finding appropriate housing for Gary was the first challenge. He wanted to buy another house in an upscale neighborhood, something that would maintain at least some of his former image. I had to convince him that spending more than $300,000 on housing would be a financial mistake, given his lack of steady income. We finally settled on a 3-bedroom ranch house in Henderson, about 10 minutes from where I lived. It was a nice house in a good neighborhood, built in the 1990s with updated kitchen and bathrooms. Most importantly, it was affordable. Gary could pay cash for it and still have substantial savings left over. The day Gary moved into his new house was emotionally complicated for both of us. On one hand, it represented Gary accepting reality and making responsible choices. On the other hand, it was a visible symbol of how far he'd fallen from his lottery-winning heights. "It's a good house, Gary," I told him as we stood in the empty living room. "It's the kind of house where real people build real lives." "I know," Gary said, but I could hear the sadness in his voice. "It's just hard to go from a mansion to this. Gary, that mansion was never really yours. You couldn't afford it, you couldn't maintain it, and you lost it. This house is different. This house you can afford. This house you can keep. This house can be a real home instead of just an expensive status symbol." Gary started the financial counseling program the following week. Dr. Margaret Rodriguez was a certified financial planner who specialized in helping people recover from financial disasters. She was tough but fair, and she didn't let Gary make excuses for his poor decisions. "Mr. Turner, Doctor," Rodriguez told Gary during one of their early sessions, "you didn't lose your money because you were unlucky or because you were the victim of bad advice. You lost your money because you never learned the difference between spending and investing, between assets and liabilities, between short-term pleasure and long-term security." The financial responsibility course at UNLV was even more humbling for Gary. He was sitting in classrooms with college students and other adults who were learning basic concepts like budgeting and compound interest, things Gary should have understood years earlier. But the most transformative part of Gary's rehabilitation was his volunteer work with the foundation. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, Gary would come to our office and help with intake calls, filing, and basic client support. He heard story after story of elderly people whose families had betrayed them financially, and slowly he began to understand that his behavior toward me hadn't been unique. It was part of a larger pattern of family financial abuse that destroyed thousands of lives every year. One evening in March 2025, Gary was helping Maria process intake calls when he took a call that changed his perspective completely. The caller was a 73-year-old woman named Dorothy, whose grandson had convinced her to co-sign a business loan for $200,000. The grandson had defaulted on the loan and disappeared, leaving Dorothy responsible for debt she couldn't afford. After Gary finished the intake call and scheduled Dorothy for a consultation with one of our volunteer attorneys, he came into my office with tears in his eyes. "Mom," he said, "I just talked to a woman whose situation is exactly like what I did to you. Her grandson took advantage of her trust, defaulted on a loan she co-signed, and left her holding the bag. She's going to lose her house because of what he did. Gary sat down heavily in the chair across from my desk. I did that to you, didn't I? I wasn't just ungrateful or selfish. I was actually abusive. I took advantage of your love for me and nearly destroyed your financial security. It was the first time Gary had truly understood the magnitude of what he'd done to me. Not just the money, not just the legal problems, but the fundamental betrayal of trust and love. Yes, Gary, I said gently. That's exactly what you did. How do you live with yourself when you realize you've been that kind of person? You start by acknowledging it, which you just did. Then you commit to never being that kind of person again. Then you spend the rest of your life trying to make amends. Is that what I'm doing? Making amends? That's part of it. But Gary, you can't make amends just to me. You need to make amends to yourself, to the person you used to be before money corrupted your values. You need to become someone you can respect again. Gary nodded and was quiet for a long time. Finally, he spoke. Mom, I want to do more than just volunteer here. I want to be part of this mission in a bigger way. I want to use my experience to help other people avoid making the mistakes I made. That conversation led to Gary becoming the Foundation's first peer counselor, someone who could speak to other family members about the damage that financial abuse causes and help them understand the importance of treating elderly relatives with respect and dignity. Gary's first speaking engagement was at a community center in North Las Vegas, addressing a group of adult children who were struggling with how to help aging parents manage their finances. Gary told his story honestly and completely, explaining how lottery winnings had corrupted his values and nearly destroyed his relationship with the woman who'd sacrificed everything for him. I thought money would solve all my problems, Gary told the group. What I learned is that money without character just creates different problems. I spent 2 years treating my mother like she was worthless because I thought wealth made me better than the people who'd helped me get where I was. I was wrong about everything. The response to Gary's presentation was overwhelming. People thanked him for his honesty, shared their own stories of family financial struggles, and asked for resources to help them avoid similar situations. Over the following months, Gary became one of our most effective advocates. His story was powerful precisely because he'd been on the wrong side of the issue. He could speak to other family members from a position of understanding rather than judgment. But the most important change was in our relationship. Slowly, gradually, Gary began to remember how to be a son. Not the entitled, arrogant man who'd called me dead weight, but the boy I'd raised to value family and loyalty and love. We started having dinner together once a week, just the two of us, talking about everything except money and legal problems and the past 2 years of heartbreak. We talked about books and movies and current events, about memories of his father and plans for the future. Gary got a job in January 2025, working as a customer service manager for a medical equipment company. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady and honest, and Gary seemed to find satisfaction in solving problems and helping people. By the spring of 2025, our relationship had healed enough that Gary felt comfortable asking me the question I'd been waiting to hear. Mom, do you think Dad would be proud of the man I'm becoming now? I thought about Bobby, about the values he'd tried to instill in Gary, about the kind of man he'd wanted his son to become. Gary, I said, your father always believed that a man's character was more important than his bank account. He believed that how you treat the people who love you says everything about who you really are. So yes, I think he'd be proud of the man you're becoming. And more importantly, I'm proud of you. Gary started crying then. And so did I. For the first time in almost 3 years, we hugged like a mother and son who genuinely loved and respected each other. The money was gone. The mansion was gone. The cars and the lifestyle and the fantasy of being rich were all gone. But my son was back, and that was worth more than all the lottery winnings in the world. Today, as I sit in my living room writing this story, it's been almost 2 years since Gary won that lottery, and 18 months since our relationship began to heal. The foundation is thriving. Gary is building a meaningful life, and I've learned more about myself and my own strength than I ever imagined possible. The Phyllis Turner Foundation for Elder Financial Justice now has 3 full-time staff members, 15 volunteer attorneys, and has helped over 400 families deal with elder financial abuse. We've recovered more than $4.8 million for elderly victims and prevented countless people from losing their homes, their savings, and their dignity to family members who forgot that love and loyalty are more valuable than money. Gary has become one of our most powerful advocates. He speaks regularly at community events, financial planning seminars, and legal conferences about the importance of treating elderly family members with respect and dignity. He's also pursuing a certificate in social work so he can provide more professional support to our clients. But more importantly, Gary has become the man I always believed he could be. He lives modestly but comfortably in his little house in Henderson. He's dating a woman named Sarah, who's a nurse at Sunrise Hospital, someone who loves him for who he is, not what he owns. He calls me twice a week just to talk, visits every Sunday for dinner, and remembers holidays and birthdays with thoughtful gestures instead of expensive gifts. The Gary who called me dead weight and suggested I move into senior living is gone, replaced by a man who understands that wealth isn't measured in dollars but in relationships, character, and the positive impact you have on other people's lives. As for me, I've never been happier or more fulfilled. At 70 years old, I'm running a successful non-profit organization, speaking publicly about issues I care deeply about, and helping people fight back against the kind of treatment I once endured. I've discovered that I'm stronger, smarter, and more resilient than I ever gave myself credit for. The money Gary was forced to pay me in our legal settlement has been the best investment I ever made. Not because it made me rich. I still live in the same modest house and drive the same reliable car, but because it allowed me to create something meaningful and lasting that helps other people. I've learned that sometimes the worst things that happen to us become the foundation for the best things we accomplish. Gary's cruelty and betrayal forced me to discover my own power and purpose. His lottery win, which seemed like a blessing that turned into a curse, ultimately became the catalyst for positive change in both our lives. I've also learned that it's never too late to start over, to find new purpose, to become the person you were always meant to be. At 68 years old, I thought my life was winding down. Instead, I discovered that my most important work was just beginning. To any woman reading this who feels powerless against family members who take advantage of your love and generosity, I want you to know something. You are stronger than you think. You have more options than you realize. You deserve to be treated with respect and dignity, regardless of your age or financial situation. Don't let anyone, not your children, not your grandchildren, not anyone, convince you that you're dead weight. You're not dead weight. You're the foundation that everything else is built on. You're the anchor that keeps families grounded. You're the wisdom that comes from years of experience and sacrifice. And if someone you love forgets your value, don't be afraid to remind them. Sometimes the people we love most need the strongest lessons to help them remember who they used to be. Gary and I have both learned that money can change people, but it doesn't have to define them. Character is what you do when no one is watching. Integrity is keeping your commitments even when it's difficult. Love is sacrificing for someone else's benefit without expecting anything in return. These are the values that matter, the values that last, the values that create real wealth, the kind of wealth that can't be won in a lottery or lost through poor decisions. It's never too late to stand up for yourself. It's never too late to demand respect. It's never too late to turn your pain into purpose and your struggle into strength. And it's never too late to teach the people you love that family isn't about what you can do for each other. It's about what you choose to do for each other. out of love, respect, and genuine care. My name is Phyllis Turner. I'm 70 years old, and I'm just getting started. If my story has touched your heart, please share it with other women who might need to hear it. Subscribe to this channel for more real stories of women who refused to give up, refused to be silently treated poorly, and found their strength when they needed it most. And remember, you're never too old to change your life, never too old to stand up for yourself, and never too old to discover that you're stronger than you ever imagined. Thank you for listening, and God bless.